So good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's armchair travel event all about Turkey. My name is Kate Suarez from the Alumni Office in Oxford, and I'm also joined in the background by Claire Baxter from the Alumni Office in Cambridge. So today's event is kindly being hosted by Temple World, one of our partners on the Alumni Travel Programme. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Richard Hunter from the Faculty of Classics at Cambridge University, who's going to take us on this virtual journey to Turkey this evening. So this event is being recorded, and if you haven't attended any of our armchair travel sessions in the past, or you've perhaps missed them, you might be interested to know that we do actually pop up all the recordings onto the alumni web pages on the Cambridge and Oxford websites. So if you have a moment, it may be worthwhile checking those out and catching up on all the exciting destinations we've featured recently. I know that many of you have already submitted questions via the Zoom registration form, but if you do have any questions for Professor Hunter, please do pop them in the chat function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screens, and there will be time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So before we hand over to Professor Hunter, Alice from Temple World would just like to say a few words. Thank you.
Hello, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm hosting this talk because Professor Hunter is very kindly doing a tour for us in September. I'm just going to share my screen, so I'm going to give you a little bit of information about that. That's me. Thank you, Kate. I'll be quite brief because I know everyone's kind of waiting for the main event. I'm the director of Temple World Travel. We were founded in the 70s by my father, who's an archaeologist, with the idea of taking students out to see digs and research overseas. And over the years, we've evolved into a worldwide small group tour specialist, and we operate tours for universities and museums like the British Museum, the Smithsonian, all led by academics and experts. And we've been designing tours for Oxford and Cambridge alumni since the very start of the Alumni Travel Programme a few decades ago now. And alongside the small group tours, we also work on tailor-made holidays, which is something I introduced when I joined the family business 10 years ago. I think some people are saying they're finding it a little bit difficult to hear me. Claire, I just want to find out, could you, if anybody can hear, I wonder if that's if you could let me know. Quite a few people are saying they can't. Much better now?
Yeah, Alice, it's better now, I think.
Okay, great. I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry, everybody. So these are the tours that we've got running this year and next year. Obviously, we're not sure which ones will definitely run, but we're hopeful that some of our autumn trips will have a good chance of going, particularly those in Europe. As you can see, it's quite a diverse range of tours. We've got wildlife tours. We've got quite a few archaeology-themed tours, which I'm hoping the people that are tuning in today are keen on finding out a bit more about. And two of them are on cruises, which are really lovely small boats. The Croatia cruise that we're doing takes only 32, for example. And this year's lack of cruise ships docking in Split and Dubrovnik will really be in our favour, I think, as without the thousands of cruise ship passengers, I think there will be. Sorry, I'm trying to read the. I'm trying to read the comments at the same time. I think quite a few people are saying my mic is tuning out and tuning in. I don't have a headset, unfortunately, so I'm going to try and keep my head as still as possible because it seems that the volume changes when I turn my head. The trip I'd like to highlight today is our Turquoise Coast tour, because this one will be accompanied, of course, by Professor Hunter, who's going to give this talk today. There it is on our website. That's the boat that we're going to be using. It's a gullet, it's a Turkish gullet, and it takes 16 people. And this is a map of the general area that we're going to be cruising through. We start in Bodrum and we end in Gerçek. Just going to show you a few quick images of the places we'll be visiting on the tour, because the pictures will do a far better job than I can. And obviously, if you're struggling to hear me, this will also help a little bit. This is the type of boat that we use. It's a motor sailor with 8 cabins, and it's got lots of outside space for sitting and sunbathing. There's a deck on the back, which is where we do all of our dining. The food is really healthy, Turkish and Mediterranean cuisine, all prepared fresh by our onboard chef using seasonal ingredients. The food is a real highlight. During the tour, when we're not visiting the major sites, we stop at some gorgeous small bays with no access by road, so we are usually the only ones there. You might see nothing but goats when you're on the boat looking up at the hillside, but often a short walk will take us to a ruined Byzantine church or the remains of a Hellenistic fort, and the beauty is, of course, you feel as though you're the only ones who may ever have found it. The major site that we're going to be visiting in the tour is, of course, Knidos, which is what Professor Hunt is going to be talking to us about today. This is one of the temples there, and I'm not sure the name of this one, so I'm sure he can fill us in. It's again, for such a major site, it's odd that there's hardly anybody there, so we have it practically to ourselves. We are also going to see Aphrodite, which is inland. This is a really important site, and it's got some quite good ruins and remains in it, including an excellent theatre. It's actually being excavated by a joint team, which is the University of New York and Oxford combined. So we are in touch with the Oxford excavation team there, with the hopes that when we visit, they'll be able to do a bit more of a show round and behind the scenes. And then this is one of the other things that we see there, which is a Roman site called Kaunos. It was a port. It's now silted up. And one of the great things about it, as well as all of the different remains there, they've got Hellenistic, they've got Roman, and they also have Byzantine. Is just a little bit further up the river. They've got these incredible, I think they're 4th century BC. These are rock-cut tombs for the Carian kings. So there's a real variety of things that you can see here. And this site in particular is important because the Carian alphabet was very difficult to decipher. And now they found a tablet here which had 2 languages on it, so they were able to use that to decipher things. And lastly, there's loads of time for swimming and just generally relaxing on these tours. So this is probably one of the most relaxing trips that we do, as well as seeing the sights and obviously Professor Hunter's brilliant lectures. We also have the opportunity for lots of free time, and the water is absolutely crystal clear. In September, it's like a bath. It's joy to be in. And this is genuinely, most people that go on these trips tell us it's the best trip they've ever been on. I wish we could take credit for that, but I honestly think it's the scenery and the just magical kind of mixture of all of the intellectual things that you're learning, as well as all of that relaxation built in. Just before I go, if you are feeling inspired after today's talk and you'd like the details of our Caria tour, or in fact any of our alumni tours, you can find them all at our website, templeworld.com. If you forget that, don't worry, you can find all of the tour details on the university alumni website too. On our website, you can get to the alumni tours by clicking on the tab at the top of the page. We realise that we might not be able to run all of our tours this year, but we are still hoping that our later tours might have a chance to run, fingers crossed. We think our Croatia tour is the other September option that has a good chance of being able to go. And as I said, the chance to go to Croatia and see it without the cruise ship crowds is really, really unique, and that opportunity is going to be gone next year. So fingers crossed we can run it this year. I'll now hand you over to Professor Hunter. Don't forget to ask your questions in the chat, and I'll be here again at the end to put a few of those to Richard before we finish for the night.
Okay, so Alice, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for coming along. I know there have been other things going on today apart from listening to me, so I'm very grateful that you all came. Now I'm going to try to share my screen to see if that works, and I hope somebody will tell me if you can't see a map of a lot of water and of Caria. So this, well, you've already seen a version of this map, and this is the area that I'm going to be talking about for a little while this evening. I should say before I start, incidentally, that the pictures and the maps I'm going to be showing you this evening are not the highest quality. This is not entirely, I have to say, because of the libraries are difficult to access currently. It's also my technological incompetence. So I hope you'll treat me very gently. So this is part of Caria, as you can see, the Aegean coast of Turkey, and the area both that I want to talk about this evening, and the area around which the cruise that Alice has just been talking about takes place. And as you can see very clearly by looking at it in this way, I mean, I'm going to be talking about Bodrum there and Knidos there, but you can see very clearly from this map how we are very much here at the Greek, in the modern language, in the Greek-Turkish interface. So there we have Turkey and Bodrum, Kinidos, but there is Simi, Kos, Kalymnos, and the whole Dodecanese, the Greek islands there. So we're clearly in a very, closely contested part of the world, and that is, of course, Rhodes, the big island down there. Now, in the period that I'm concerned with this evening, which broadly speaking, the classical period, let us say, from the 5th century before Christ onwards, there were two large or principal populations of Caria. One was Greek, and this is an area which has a very, very rich Greek inscriptions, as well, of course, as artwork and statuary, which we'll be looking at also. The second principal population of Caria in classical antiquity was what we call Carians, presumably the people who were there before the Greeks came. Now, Carians, Alice already indicated in her opening words that some of the riches of Carian civilization, such as the rock-cut tombs at Kaunos. Carian civilization is, however, one of the less well-known Anatolian civilizations, particularly from the point of view of its language. Somebody I know before this evening sent in a question asking me about the Carian language, and I am very far from an expert, but we do know, thanks in good part to the bilingual inscription, which Alice mentioned, which was discovered at Kaunos, as well as various briefer bilingual inscriptions left by Carian mercenaries in Egypt, that Carian was an Anatolian language and an Indo-European language. All of the Anatolian languages belong to the Indo-European family, but broke off at a relatively early date from Proto-Indo-European, and indeed have been, it's the Anatolian languages which have been extremely important in assembling the whole notion of what the Indo-European language was like. The Carian alphabet is not entirely unlike the Greek alphabet, and clearly they're related, although what look like similar letters very often mean very different things. Now, I'm going to be talking this evening about Knidos and Bodrum. You can see they're not so far away. Many of you may indeed have made that boat trip, as I have, from Knidos across to Bodrum, and it can be very rough, believe me. Through the period that we're going to be concerned with this evening, on the whole, this area of Caria was ruled by a Carian dynasty who are usually referred to as the Hecatomnids. The most famous of them, Mausoleum, we will come to in a moment. And they ruled this area of Caria from Bodrum inland with some kind or under some kind of general hegemony of the Persians. And that situation lasted with on and off until Alexander. And when Alexander, towards the end of the 4th century, came, he sacked what is now Bodrum, and from then on, for the rest of antiquity, this area was very largely Greek, purely Greek, much more so than Latin, and the Roman influence, particularly in terms of language and culture, is much less visible in this part of Asia Minor than it is in some others. So let's now have a look at Bodrum, which is the first place I want to be concerned with. Now, I just show you what Google Maps tells you that Bodrum is like, simply because, for two reasons. One is it's important that Bodrum is, as you can see, south-facing in this, and I'll also be concerned before too long with this peninsula that sticks out to the southwest, because we're going to be looking at an extraordinary find from there. The castle of Bodrum, which I'm sure many of you know and we'll look at in a moment, is situated there at the entrance to the harbour. Now, Bodrum is, as you know, a very popular tourist centre, an extremely nice place to spend time. But from the point of view of antiquities and archaeology, it can seem perhaps a bit disappointing. The reason for this is that what was a flourishing Greek city, first Doric and then an Ionian city. It was the city probably for many people most famous as the home of Herodotus, the historian, perhaps the first we often call the father of history, even in antiquity, as we'll see in a moment. But most of the antiquities of Bodrum have gone. Many presumably destroyed, the classical ones by Alexander when he set fire to the city. Many also, as we'll see in a moment, the most famous plundered later on. So Bodrum itself is not the place to go for to see in situ, as it were, the great archaeological sites. On the other hand, it has an extraordinary situation and extraordinary views. And curiously, antiquity is there if you know where to look for it. Now, many of you will have been there. I've just taken off Getty Images, some pictures of the harbour. And of course, as many of you will know, the harbour is, of course, dominated by the castle of St. Peter, erected in something like its current form in the 15th century by the Knights of St. John, and on the site of what was an earlier castle. And it really is a very, very impressive building. And there's some more views of it, as I say. I'm sure many of you will know of it. And as it's said that Bodrum, the name of the city, of the town, is derived from Petronium, the city of Peter, which was the name that the Knights Hospitaller gave the city. So here are some more images of the castle. Now, the other reason why Halicarnassus was most famous today is because of the Mausoleum. And this takes us now to the 4th century before Christ, when in that period Halicarnassus became the capital city, if you like, of the kingdom of Mausoleum, who moved his capital from what is modern Mylasa to Halicarnassus, and set about a remarkable program of building and political conquest and the establishment of Halicarnassus as a major, as we would say, international center. And the most famous such building is unfortunately gone. And this is the Mausoleum, named for him, Mausolus, built, so we are led to believe, in the middle of the century after his death as a tomb for him by his wife Artemisia. And the Mausoleum became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood some 40 plus meters high, and here in this very cautious reconstruction, combined elements of Greek, local Carian, and possibly even Egyptian archaeology or architecture, I should say, with the stepped pyramid at the top. Now, what happened to the Mausoleum? Well, curiously, or not curiously, like many ancient antiquities, it survived a lot longer than one might think. And there's good reason to believe that the Mausoleum survived in something like its original form, at least until the 13th or possibly even the 14th century, when it was largely destroyed by an earthquake, as indeed in this area so many monuments were. This part of Turkey, as well as Lycia to the south and Lydia to the north, are, as you will know, very prone to earthquake. So it fell down, as it were, in the earthquake, but there's always a silver lining for somebody, and in this case, the silver lining was for the Knights of St. John, who were looking for stone for the castle of St. Peter. And the castle of St. Peter that we were looking at before is very largely built from stonework that is a very strong chance of having come from the Mausoleum. The site of the Mausoleum has been identified, and you can go there and look at the ground plan of it, but there is not much more than that. Some of the famous lions of which you can see there in this reconstruction of the Mausoleum were in fact found placed in the walls of the castle. One thing I should say is that we're now dealing with a part of the world where very many of the amazing antiquities are in fact very close to home, because as I'm sure you will know, very many of these antiquities from this part of the world are indeed on display in the British Museum. And the two great figures here are Charles Fellows and Charles Newton, two British archaeologists and explorers, adventurous people, very, in some ways, sort of typical of what we think of as Victorians, who explored this part of Caria and indeed Lycia further south, and arranged in various ways for antiquities to be taken back to London. Charles Fellows is particularly known as the man responsible for Xanthos and the famous, for example, the Nereid monument, which many of you will know in the British Museum. Of Mausolus himself and his tomb, presumably in the base beneath the Mausoleum, there is no trace left in the outline plan, but there is quite a good chance that actually when the Knights were there in the early 16th century, it was still somehow that the burial chamber was intact. And there is an account surviving of how the burial chamber, with presumably Mausoleus's body in its casket, was indeed found in 1522 by the knights, who made the terrible mistake of discovering it and then not doing anything about it. And they went back the next day, and of course it had gone. Tomb robbers, etc. So that was unfortunately why we don't have that. But what we do have, not from the actual site of the mausoleum, but from very nearby, are some of the things that Charles Newton discovered, and these are almost certainly from the mausoleum itself. And these will be familiar to you. There's a head found in a nearby field who all but certainly is Mausolus himself. Here are the figures. Again, you will have seen them, or so many of you will have seen them in the British Museum. A chariot driver from the period, and this wonderful horse's head with its bridle still intact, discovered nearby the site of the mausoleum, and presumably not reused because of difficulty, and also, of course, because of not being suitable for building works. And so I think this horse's head in particular gives one some kind of sense of the grandeur and ambition of the mausoleum. One of the friezes around the mausoleum depicted the battle with the Amazons, and here are some well-known images, not particularly brilliantly reproduced, I'm afraid, from the frieze of the battle with the Amazons. And all of these were, as it were, saved by the work of Charles Newton and have saved to be admired today. Okay. I particularly like this one. But as I said, one does not, unfortunately, have to go to Caria, or perhaps you would say fortunately, in order to see these. What I want to do, however, is, before we leave Bodrum, is to look briefly at two poems, one famous, perhaps one less famous, which are connected with Halicarnassus, because Halicarnassus was a city of writers, as well as of extraordinary monuments. And the first one, in thinking of this as two poems, I want to give probably one of the best known and most anthologized poems in English, in one version. And this is an epigram of Callimachus from Cyrene in North Africa, a very famous poet working at Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ, one of my favorite Greek poems. Heraclitus, someone told me your death, and it brought me to tears. I remembered how often the two of us sank the sun with our talking. You, my Halicarnassian friend, are, I assume, ash 4 ages old, but your nightingales live on. Hades, who snatches everything away, will not get his hands on those. So this is a poem commemorating an acquaintance of the poet Heraclitus from Halicarnassus, who himself was a poet. One poem of Heraclitus survives, and we also know a little something about him. He was something of a diplomat. Indeed, he seems to have traveled the Aegean, including to North Africa, on behalf of his native city of Halicarnassus. And this epigram, as many of you will know, was translated in 1845 by William Johnson Corey, then a master at Eton, for a Greek translation class. It's very Victorian in all kinds of ways. I think you either like it or you don't, I have to say. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old Carian guest, a handful of grey ashes, long, long ago at rest. Still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake, for death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. As I say, one of the most anthologized of all English poems, very, very different from the Greek original, but that's not of itself a bad thing. Johnson Corey, a very, very, very interesting figure, was dismissed under at least obscure circumstances from being a master at Eton in 1872. Retired back to Devon and eventually moved to Madeira, where at the age of more than 50, he married a local girl of 20, and then eventually retired back to England. But certainly a character, if you're interested in 19th century education, very much a character worth pursuing. There's an extremely interesting biography of him. Well, actually, it's more like a hagiography by Faith Compton Mackenzie, but certainly worth dipping into. So that's one Halicarnassian poem. And I just very quickly thought you might be interested in another Halicarnassian poem. This was only discovered in 1995, and it was discovered on that peninsula, which I showed you on the map of Bodrum earlier, that sticks out from in the southwest, facing the castle, and that is the promontory of Salmakis, or Kaplan Kaleshi, or I'm afraid my Turkish is not great. And this is half of the inscription. That's the other half of the inscription. You'll see there's a great missing bit there, but you'll see it's pretty well preserved and extremely well, very neatly written. I'm sorry, the photograph is not better. And here is a translation about it. And what this poem is a poem about what Halicarnassus is proud of, all the things that Halicarnassus has achieved. And that's why this poem has come to be called amongst scholars the pride of Halicarnassus. But as I said, it was only published in 1995. And it offers here, in these lines, it offers the story of Hermaphroditos, the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, who, according to this story, as you can see here in line 19, became an extraordinary man who invented matrimony for mankind and was the first to fasten the matrimonial bed by law. And you might say, well, that's a very strange thing for somebody called Hermaphroditos, because that's not what we think of as hermaphrodites' major characteristics. And indeed, there is I'll show you a hermaphrodite in a moment, but there you'll see, when the poem continues, you'll see that Herodotus, the Homer of history in prose, is named in the poem as one of the great figures of Halicarnassus. The date of the poem is probably the late 2nd century before Christ, although people have argued that it is rather later than that. It's in elegiac couplets, and it is, apart from that one missing bit, remarkably preserved, and was found, as I said, in situ in 1995. And then the poem continues with other great figures from Halicarnassus. Now, the child of Hermes and Aphrodite, Hermaphroditos, is normally known not for being, as it were, a great civilizer of mankind. We have a number of ancient images of Hermaphroditos, which are all normally thought to go back to a lost original. This is the kind of thing that art historians always say. This one, for example, is in Rome. And there's another famous one there in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Thought usually, as I said, to go back to a lost Hellenistic original. And the story of Hermaphroditos is not usually the story that the Pride of Halicarnassus tells us. It's rather that a famous story in Ovid about how the nymph Salmacis fell in love with this son of Hermes and Aphrodite, dragged him into the water and clung to him so close that they became one body. And in his anguish at this, he cursed anybody who drank the waters, that any man who drank the waters of this spring would become effeminized, hence the myth of Hermaphroditos. But there clearly was another myth, much more, as it were, favorable to the local waters, which the people of Halicarnassus promoted. And we see that in that poem, The Pride of Halicarnassus. And indeed, there's a wonderful story in Vitruvius, the architectural historian, writing at the time of Octavian, at the end of the 1st century BC, about how when the colonists, Greek colonists had driven the Carians up into the hills, the Carians were deprived of their city. But then one of the Greeks realized how wonderful the water of this spring was and opened a kind of spa. I mean, a very sort of modern tourist development, opened a spa and a hotel, as it were, next to the spring. And this brought all the Carians down from the hills to sample the waters. And it was because of that that these barbarian Carians became civilized, because the waters of this spring had civilizing powers. And that clearly also is the version of the legend which we find in The Pride of Halicarnassus, not the rather more racy story of Hermaphroditos, which Ovid gives us in the Metamorphoses. Okay, so Bodrum, Halicarnassus, a city of writers and of poets and of poems. I want now to move on to Knidos, and I have Knidos, as those of you who've been there will know, a most remarkable and very, very beautiful site. You remember, well, let me just go back to our original map. There, you'll see that, as you will know, Knidos there, right on the end of the Dacia Peninsula. But in fact, we know that until the 4th century, the city of Knidos was in fact further east on the peninsula. But it was decided in the 4th century, as a result of, a typical result of incursions, battles, foreign problems, etc., to move and found a new city right on this site at the end of the peninsula. And it was designed in such a way as to bridge a small isthmus between what was essentially the mainland and a kind of island, to create a city with 2 harbors, one facing out and the other in. And this is what you can see now. When I find this picture again, you can see you can see the inner harbor there, and then there is another harbor on the other side. And Knidos is this wonderful, wonderful site just geographically. It's a wonderful place to go, and it has substantial ancient remains. There is an agora, people walking very broad streets, and it has a wonderfully preserved theatre. And you can go up and stand. And as Alice said earlier, Knidos, on the whole, is never really overrun by tourists. And it is, because of its position, a wonderful place just to walk around. So there's the theatre. Now, Knidos is perhaps most famous for one image. And this, and one of the things which links Bodrum, Halicarnassus, and Knidos is that the most famous image, the most famous artwork associated with the two places is lost. Just as the Mausoleum is destroyed, so is the original of this image, the Aphrodite of Knidos, by the sculptor, 4th century sculptor Praxiteles, is lost. Pliny tells us in a later story that Praxiteles made 2 images of Aphrodite. One had clothes on and the other didn't, and he gave the people of Kos who wanted to buy an Aphrodite from him the chance to choose whichever they want. And being very proper, the people of Kos chose the one with clothes on, which meant that the Knidians grabbed Aphrodite without her clothes on, and therefore established in Kinidos what became probably the most famous ancient female image for centuries. And it was probably, the original was probably lost in the 5th century after Christ in a fire after it had been moved to Constantinople. A large number of ancient copies of the Cnidian Aphrodite survive, and art historians can't, of course, agree on what the original one looked like. This image, which as you can see is in Rome, is often thought to be one of the ones which is closest to, gives you, if you like, some idea of what Praxiteles' original statue looked like. What was so extraordinary about Praxiteles' image is not that Aphrodite was naked. Nakedness was not exactly new in Greek statuary, but rather the idea that the Aphrodite statue celebrates the female form in a way which really had not happened in Greek statuary art before. Aphrodite, the way she stands, the very fleshiness of her body is all something apparently new in Greek art. She was known, the Cnidian Aphrodite is Aphrodite Euploia, Aphrodite of the fair voyage, and there were different explanations were offered for why at Knidos she had this cult title. One version is that after she was born on the island of Cyprus, she traveled north from Cyprus and stopped off at Kinidos in order to bathe, hence this image. But in fact, Aphrodite Euploia is a goddess who was regularly invoked by sailors and those setting off on hoping for a fair voyage. This statue was so famous that a whole body of myth and legend grew up around it. The most famous story being that one young man fell in love with the goddess and was so crazed that he eventually found a way of getting himself locked into the temple at night with her, and in the morning a stain, a blemish was found in the marble on her thigh to show, as Lucian tells us, what the goddess had suffered overnight. And the crazed young man threw himself over a cliff, as crazed young men in antiquity normally did. Now, a number of things one would like to say about the image of Aphrodite. One of the extraordinary things about it, of course, is the position of Aphrodite's right arm and her right hand there. And of course, I would stress that we don't exactly know the angle and the position, but we do know from a written account that one of her hands was trying, as Lucian says, to cover her modesty. But one also might, of course, say, is she covering her modesty? Is she pointing where we should look? Why is she made to do that? And I mean, are all, the young man goes crazy with love and locks himself up with her overnight. But are we, to what extent is this a statue which invites all of us to become voyeurs? And this is now a reconstruction of the back of the statue. And why this is important is, as you can see from this reconstruction by Iris Love here of the temple of Aphrodite on Knidos, it was open on all sides, so that although there was a principal entrance, the goddess could indeed be viewed in the round. And that's why the back view of the plaster cast back view of a reconstruction is important, because one was expected, as it were, to view the goddess all the way around. And this was unusual for Greek temples. Normally, as you know, with a Greek temple, you just enter in one direction, face the god, and leave in the same way. That was not the case on the temple of Aphrodite on Kinidos. Now, this idea of what are we looking at, how do we look at this goddess, what is it we're actually looking at, was something, a theme which is not an invention of modern art historians, but was certainly recognized in antiquity. Is this a woman? Is it a goddess? Is it a statue? What is it? And the two visitors to this Aphrodite in particular deserve just a moment's attention before we finish. One is our old friend, the god Pan, and this is an image, a statue group, which was found on Delos from the late Hellenistic period. Clearly we have Aphrodite there. We have the boy Eros, Cupid there, and we have Pan. Now, this is clearly a different Aphrodite from the Cnidian Aphrodite, but there is much in common, including to some extent the way she stands. And of course, in this case, notice it's her left hand, apparently trying to conceal her modesty. And Pan here appears to be trying to pull her hand away. In other words, doing in some ways what male viewers do with the images of females. And she appears to be going to slap him with her sandal. And this is, some people think this is this has been described as motel art, a bit tawdry in some ways. But actually, if we think of it as some kind of commentary on the Aphrodite of Knidos, I think it shows us extremely well how ancient viewers understood many of the things about Praxiteles' revolutionary portrayal of a female body that modern viewers have found. So Pan is one spectator, but probably the most surprising spectator for the Cnidian Aphrodite is Aphrodite herself. And here is a poem for, as you can see, attributed to Plato, but certainly not by Plato, from the Greek anthology, presumably a Hellenistic or imperial poem. Paphian Kythera, that is the Lady of Kythera, Aphrodite, came through the waves to Knidos, wishing to see her own image. And having viewed it from all sides in the open shrine, she cried, "Where did Praxiteles see me naked?" So this is a poem, the conceit of which is that Aphrodite herself is a viewer of this famous statue of herself in Knidos, and whereas she comes to admire and like the visitors to the temple itself, walks all around Pante in Greek there from all sides. So does she too. But of course, unlike Pan, she doesn't seek to assault the statue. You can find the site of the temple of Aphrodite, Ploia at Knidos, is there, and in fact that was shown in one of Alice's earlier slides. It occupies a wonderful site up above the town with views to both seas, and although you won't find the statue in situ there, it certainly makes the trip to Knidos, as they say, well worth it. So I'm afraid I've gone far over time. I've gone on much longer than I was told to go on. So I'm going to stop there and then take, well, Alice or somebody is going to tell me what to do. Alice, shall I stop sharing now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Great. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I learned plenty of new things there. I hope that your sound sounded absolutely great all the way through there. So I hope I've changed the setting on mine. I very much hope that mine is now a bit better than it was before. In any event, we have had some questions. It would be great if you could have a go at answering some of these before we finish. Patrick Field from Cambridge asks, has any progress been made towards elucidating the ancient language of Caria? So it's one of the things that we were discussing.
Yes, well, as I say, I mentioned, I mean, one of the problems with the decipherment of Carian is that although is simply the evidence, we just don't have enough material. There is, as you mentioned, there is this the longest inscription is a bilingual Kaunos, but there are also bilingual tomb inscriptions in Egypt left by Carian mercenaries. So some of the basics of Carian are understood, but there are still very, very many questions. It's clear that, well, I mean, but two important things to say. One is, as I said, that it is an Anatolian Indo-European language, as of course are Lydian, Luvian, and so forth. And secondly, that we know that the script, Carian script, was an alphabetic script. In other words, it wasn't a syllabary. So it is like Greek to that extent. As many of you will know, the Greek alphabet was in fact borrowed from Phoenicia, further to the south and to the east. But the Carian script clearly has some links to the Greek script, even though, as I said, the sounds indicate. But there is still, we just need more evidence with Carian.
Okay, great. Yes, it looks as though there's definitely a bit more. They find another tablet.
Well, we live in, but of course, I mean, the problem is that the antiquities are, a great many of them are lost, and particularly, and one of the things which will have happened, of course, is that inscriptions and artifacts which have on them indecipherable languages are particularly prone to reuse and destruction, because people aren't concerned if they have something they can't read, it is of no value to them, and so it'll often be just destroyed.
Gosh, it's such a shame, isn't it? Another question. Steve Henry, also Cambridge, has asked, do we have any understanding of the environmental impact of these past civilizations, such as their management of the landscape?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question, and it's there's a lot of interest at the moment. There's great, generally in the humanities, in what you might call eco-criticism and eco-history. For this particular area of Caria, we can say really very, very little. Of course, you can say things like, well, clearly the building of great cities and monuments, like the Mausoleum, take stone out of, obviously to some extent scar the landscape, and indeed it's possible to identify with pretty reasonable precision the quarries from which the stone for the Mausoleum came. In terms of management of the landscape, I mean, we understand quite well farming practices from this period and in this area. But in terms of managing the landscape, I think it is indeed large-scale industrial societies which have which inflict the damage, which to some extent largely agricultural societies don't. So, I mean, I think it's one of the things we can probably release the Carians from blame for.
Yeah, certainly. I'm sure they've done a lot less damage than we are currently doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Carol has asked, one of the images shown before the talk of the necropolis that was at Kaunos, carved into the rock, looked a bit like some of the monuments in Petra. Is there any link?
Well, that's a very good question, to which I would have to say I do not know. But maybe somebody here does know. Petra is one of those places I've always wanted to go but have never been.
Well, so I've seen both up close, and there is a similarity, but I think the way they construct them seems to be, they've used different methods. But there is, with the pillars and everything, there is definitely, I think they're taking inspiration from the same sort of things by the looks of things.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the rock cut tombs at Kaunos, the effect is clearly to create the facade of a temple.
Yeah.
And they are remarkable, those tombs, yes. But I'm afraid I simply don't know about Petra.
We have had a question of, see, it's up here a little bit in the chat. Let me just go. Professor Hunter has been talking about places near the sea. Are there any indications of a maritime influence on their cultural remains, whether physical or from other sources?
Well, I'm not absolutely sure I quite understand, but yes, I mean, the sea is crucial, absolutely crucial. I mean, Halicarnassus, particularly under Mausoleum, became a major maritime power. We know that then, in the period after Alexander, Halicarnassus fell under the control of the Ptolemies, and the Ptolemaic navy controlled that whole part of the Mediterranean. Very famous. Knidos was the home of a very famous Ptolemaic admiral. And I mean, as you can see from the position of Kinidos, commercial trade over the sea is just what is absolutely central to all of that whole coastline. The whole coastline is, sort of, and I think that whole coastline is also absolutely full of shipwrecks. I mean, from very, very many centuries, including one of the very rare Bronze Age shipwrecks that we possess. There's a famous shipwreck at Bodrum, which, among other things, is famous for having a writing tablet, a writing tablet, and that's one of our earliest surviving writing tablets. But that whole area and the shipwrecks are one very small, obviously random measure of the importance of the sea. And there is just no getting away from it as the central commercial route, because as I'm sure everyone will know, the interior, the hinterland behind the coast is mountainous, and travel there is much harder than travel would be around the coasts.
That's actually helps with another question, which is going to be the last, I'm afraid, which somebody has asked. John Lipsey from Oxford has asked, what's the best means to travel to explore this region, car, boat, train or other? And I think you've answered that, haven't you?
Well, yes. I mean, in one sense, it's a no-brainer. The only problem, of course, is that there are lots of things you want to see which you can't get to by boat. There's a very good bus service, to some extent. I think probably these days the best thing to do is indeed to try to go as far as you can by boat, but also be prepared from time to time, perhaps, to catch the bus, or indeed to rent a car to go somewhere like Aphrodite. And so, I mean, when I was last on which I'm afraid is now too long ago, when I was last on the Dacia Peninsula, which leads, or which Knidos is perched at the end, the road is pretty dreadful, and I'm very glad I wasn't driving. And Knidos, or actually Bodrum too. These are if you get the chance to approach them, well, certainly Knidos, approach by boat if you can, but Bodrum too, even to approach it but from the sea is much nicer.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there, and I obviously not to plug the tour again, but that that is the best way of doing it. We know where all of the little hidden gems are, as well as the kind of major sites. As I said, there's quite a few places you park up in a tiny bay, go for a little hike up the hillside, and you might come across a little ruined apse or some Hellenistic fort remains, and they're just sitting there and nobody really knows they're there. So I do think it's perfect, and the roads, as you say, to some of the sites are not great. So I think boat's the most comfortable way and the easiest and quickest way. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. That was really informative, and the comments have been really positive on the chat. So really appreciate you taking the time to explain this today.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening.
And thank you to everybody who joined us as well. Thanks for giving up your evening. I'm glad it didn't clash with the football. But we may have had a few viewers.
Football.
No, sorry. But yes, thank you very much for joining us. And I know that there are future events. If you keep an eye on the alumni websites, I know there's going to be a few more of these. Maybe not quite so great as this one, but thank you indeed. Have a lovely evening, everybody. We're going to stop the meeting now.